Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next session of Hood Talks. This is a series dedicated to trending topics, important emerging trends. So I think you will find today's talk is all of those. My name is Dr. April Bolton, and I am the Dean of the Graduate School here at Hood College, and I get the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker tonight. So thank you all for spending a little bit of time with us tonight. I think you'll walk away edified and empowered and really feeling like you've got some next steps around this topic. So welcome. Dr. Megan Shaine is a counselor, educator, and licensed clinician with extensive experience in clinical supervision, teaching, and research. She's currently associate professor and chair of psychology and counseling at Hood College, where she's also served as the program director for our clinical mental health counseling program. It was actually in that role that Dr. Shaine developed a trauma, crisis, grief, and loss certificate, which is in part the inspiration for tonight's session. Let's see, lost my place because there's a lot to say about Dr. Shaine. She also helped establish our neighborhood counseling and training center, where our counseling master's students, supervised by licensed faculty, clinicians, staff, serve clients from Hood College and the broader Frederick community for free. So we are very proud of our neighborhood counseling and training center because we know it provides essential support and mental health services to those in our community who need them, but may have a difficult time paying for them. So very proud of that work. Dr. Shaine holds a PhD in counseling from the George Washington University, where her dissertation focused on peer social support in military-affiliated students with post-traumatic stress. Dr. Shaine's teaching experience includes courses in diagnosis and psychological disorders, counseling techniques, and trauma and crisis intervention. She's also a dedicated researcher and well-published in academic journals on post-traumatic growth, mental health care for trans service members, and teaching trauma, grief, and loss in counselor education. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Shaine is a licensed professional counselor and clinical supervisor with a private practice focused on, not surprisingly, trauma, grief, and clinical supervision. It is now my great pleasure to welcome to the Zoom podium, Dr. Megan Shaine.
Thank you, Dr. Bolton. And of course, because I'm giving a lecture on trauma and society, there are sirens going in the background very appropriately. So I am sorry about that if you hear additional sirens. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am so pleased to see so many folks joining. I'm really honored. I see former students, current students, colleagues, and many new names from the community. And I'm really pleased to be with you here tonight and really grateful to Dr. Bolton and Ms. Fowler-Corsi for setting this up for us. So again, my name is Dr. Shaine, and I am here to talk to you this evening about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and mind, which is trauma and how it affects us more broadly in society. So what I would like to move through with you tonight is really working from a trauma-informed framework that I'm going to start by introducing you to. And then what we're going to do is learn a little bit more about the signs and impact of trauma, both at that individual level as well as kind of writ large. I know we probably have a diverse group here on the call tonight. I know we have some experts, some colleagues of mine who this will really be review, and then some folks who are here out of their own personal interest or professional interest, where some of this material may be new. So I want to be respectful of that breadth of knowledge base that we have. And then for all of us, coming together, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we might move towards a more trauma responsive society. So some of you might be familiar with the concept of trauma-informed care. This was developed over the past several decades and kind of culminated with the release by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in 2018 of a trauma-informed care framework. And originally, this was really developed for organizations to think about how they might become more trauma-informed. But I would argue that we could apply this to systems and communities as well. So a program, organization, a system that is trauma-informed does a couple of key things. It realizes the nature and the widespread ways that trauma impacts and affects us in society. That system is able to be knowledgeable and recognize those signs and symptoms of trauma as they're showing up in the collective. That system is also able to be responsive and adaptive, integrating knowledge, like some of the knowledge that you may gain tonight, into whatever your practice may be. And a trauma-informed system is also going to seek to actively resist re-traumatization. So when we talk about resisting re-traumatization, we think about practices that really work to avoid reactivating, reenacting those traumatic events that the individual or community has already experienced. So I'm going to start by working through some information about how we can realize the widespread impact and effects of trauma. So when I teach my trauma and crisis intervention class, I always start kind of at the really broad level of talking about what stress is. And I imagine that the feeling of stress is quite familiar to most of you as students, professionals, community members. Stress is a universal experience. And unfortunately, I think right now, an experience that many of us are grappling with a lot of the time. And I want you to just think for a moment about what stress feels like for you. What are some signals for you that you are feeling stressed? And you can write it down. You can pop it in the chat if you want. Only the hosts of the meeting are going to be able to see the chat, but you're welcome to pop it into us. What are some signs for you that show you that you're feeling stressed? And so I know for a lot of folks, when we do this in class, we talk about reactions like a racing heart or sweaty palms or feeling lightheaded, or perhaps feeling like you're having difficulty concentrating, a pain in your gut. It's a predictable reaction that you have. It's a sign for you that you can tell that I'm experiencing stress right now. So stress is that universal experience, but it's universal and individualized. So it's any uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by those predictable physiological, biochemical, behavioral changes. And it happens in response usually to specific stimuli, like current events, for example, like at a smaller level, taking an exam. It occurs in response to something specific, and often the same things that stressed you out last week are going to stress you out this week too. The good news is stress, while typically an unpleasant feeling for most people, is designed to be an adaptive process. The human stress response is designed to respond in the face of a threat or stressor, to appropriately evaluate and analyze that threat or stressor, and then to downregulate itself in the event that the threat or stressor has been resolved or was actually a false threat. The problem is that doesn't always go as planned. So let's talk about what trauma is, because stress and trauma are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. The word trauma actually comes from the Greek word for wound. Some of you may know that. And that always strikes me because when we think about trauma in the medical sense, this is a force to our body that is so great that it overwhelms our natural protections, our skin, our skull, and it causes an injury to the body. Psychological trauma is really no different. It just happens to the mind instead of the body. And so, what happens here is that we have an experience of emotional distress that overwhelms the body's natural protections. So, we can think about our natural protections as emotion regulation, coping mechanisms, our cognitive frameworks for processing through traumatic events. These are our natural protections against something that is stressful or traumatic. And when psychological trauma occurs, it breaks through those natural protections that we have established for ourselves or that we have inherently. So, what makes for a traumatic event? We can think about this in a broad sense. The National Institute of Mental Health defines a traumatic event as any shocking, scary, or dangerous experience that affects someone emotionally and physically. The DSM-5-TR, which is the diagnostic manual that we use primarily in this country, and similarly the ICD, which is used more broadly throughout the world, would say that in order to be diagnosed with something like PTSD, that event has to involve a threat to life, bodily integrity, something like that. Okay, so on a more severe end. Now, this can be direct, but it could also be witnessed in person rather than directly happening to you. It could be witnessed indirectly by learning that somebody really close to you experienced that traumatic event. And interestingly, and this was a change in 2013, it could also be experienced through hearing repeated and extreme details to that of that event, of that traumatic event. We know that trauma is extremely common. I think if you're seeing these numbers for the first time, they might surprise you. 90% of the population experiences at least one traumatic event across the lifetime. And in fact, the most likely thing is that you're going to experience more than one. Most people, the most frequent number of traumatic events experience is three. The most common type of traumatic event that folks experience across the lifetime is not a natural disaster or an accident or combat trauma. Okay? It's assault. It's physical or sexual assault experienced by more than half of the population. So, does this mean that everybody has PTSD? No, right? Everybody does not have PTSD. In fact, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD is somewhere between 7 and 9%, depending on the study that you look at. So that's interesting to think about. Why do so many people experience trauma, but only a smaller number of the population experience PTSD? Well, some of them will experience another trauma and stressor related disorder, or anxiety, depression, a personality disorder, perhaps, which might be related to trauma as well. We also know that there are certain demographic risk factors for developing PTSD. This is far more common in women and gender diverse individuals. It's far more common in US Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, and Alaska Natives as compared to non-Latino white European Americans. This is also a disorder that begins early in life, typically. 3/4 of lifetime cases of PTSD start before age 24. Okay, so this is an early life disorder. We also know that the closer you are to a traumatic event, physical proximity and emotional proximity, how scary you experience that threat to be, as well as a lack of social support before, during, after the event are all really strong predictors of why one person might develop PTSD and the next person may not. So we talked about some of those demographic risk factors, right? And I think we can begin to chart out what is going on there. And since this is a talk about trauma in society, we need to talk about historical, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. I think this is fascinating because we see trauma-related or similar symptoms showing up in subsequent generations, generations of groups that did not directly experience the primary collective trauma. For example, the children of Holocaust survivors. We see the transmission of emotional distress and suffering from the generation before, or even two generations before, that experienced the primary traumatic event. And here we're talking about events that are extremely traumatic, involving the long-term subjugation, marginalization of one group by another group. We're talking about things like genocide, systemic racism, oppression, slavery. Okay. We even see this showing up at the genetic level in folks' DNA. There is some evidence to support that there are actual epigenetic changes that occur. We see alterations in how genes are expressed, and these genes are related to anxiety, depression, and PTSD. We have seen this passed down to children of a Dutch famine. There's a very famous study that showed the effects of malnutrition and famine showing up at a genetic level in subsequent generations. And then for Holocaust and 9/11 survivors, their children also showing epigenetic changes to genes that are related to mental health and our capacity to handle stress. Interesting, right? We talked about how this is a disorder that often shows up very early in life, and certainly our early childhood traumas can be some of the most impactful. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of adverse childhood experiences. This came out of a study that was first conducted in the 1990s by Dr. Richard Felitti and a group of researchers with Kaiser Permanente out in California. It was a large-scale study with around 17,000 participants that originally developed the original 10 ACEs. And they were looking at the frequency of these adverse childhood experiences in the population, as well as possible links to mental and physical health outcomes. We use the ACE scale or the ACE questionnaire quite frequently in the mental health field. I think it can be useful for anybody to know what their ACE score is. You simply just calculate your ACE score by totaling up how many of these particular experiences that you experienced before age 18 in the categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So the findings were quite striking, and this was the original study. 67% of adults reporting experiencing at least one of those adverse childhood experiences, but actually a fifth had experienced more than three or more, and then almost 13% four or more. This is big. This pattern was showing up across demographic groups, and perhaps the most striking finding was there is a dose-response relationship between those ACEs and mental and physical health outcomes. So the more ACEs you've experienced, the poorer your mental and physical health outcomes, like cardiac disease, for example, tended to be. Now, since the original ACE study, which has been replicated several times, showing very similar results, there has been some criticism, but and moving the concept forward, that perhaps the original concept of ACEs focused a little too narrowly on the household, on individuals, on the family, and didn't take into consideration the context of what was going on around the family as the child was growing up. So if we think back to that idea of historical and cultural trauma, that becomes important here. So the Philadelphia ACE project was conducted more recently in 2017, 2018. We saw the publication come out. And this took into account what is going on in outside communities. You can see the conventional ACEs here in the middle, but we have expanded ACEs on the outside. Things like how safe is your neighborhood? How much violence is there? Systemic racism and oppression. Have you lived in the foster care system? Experienced bullying? And when we take into account that context and those additional ACEs, in this particular sample, which was a sample which we would expect to have a high number of ACEs, 83.2 participants had at least one of these ACEs versus that 70% in the original study. So it changes the pyramid a little bit, right? I showed you the first pyramid on the other screen, and it really roots the experience of trauma in that generational and historical trauma, even sort of in that DNA, right? And then it moves up. What are the social conditions? Is the individual experiencing systemic racism? Have they experienced complex trauma, which we'll talk about in a moment? So it really uses this idea of the historical and cultural trauma as the foundation that leads to that dose response relationship and can, in worst cases, lead to a shorter lifespan and early death. So we just talked about realizing the impact of trauma. And I want to move on to recognizing those signs and symptoms of trauma. So again, for some of you, this is going to be review, but review never hurts. And others, this might be new information for you. So this is the human stress response. Some of you might know it as the fight, flight, or freeze response, the fight, flight response, the fight, flight, fawn response. We have a couple of new Fs being argued for on the scene in recent years. The human stress response actually has two different systems at work. It's a two-tiered system that is initiated by your body's alarm bell, which is called the amygdala. The amygdala is a primitive structure within your brain that acts as your body's watchdog. So when you are on a hike in the woods and you see a bear, or you think you see a bear, your amygdala starts to flash. It starts to send alarm signals to other parts of your brain, namely the hypothalamus, which is your brain's relay center. The hypothalamus receives one message with the initial spotting of the threat, and then it's going to receive the second one about 10 seconds later. The first message activates the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis. A mouthful, right? This axis is what's responsible for those classic hyperarousal symptoms, the heart racing, the sweaty palms, probably the things that you thought of when I asked you what it feels like to be stressed. This is the adrenaline pumping through your veins. About 10 seconds later, on the other side, the hypothalamus sends another message to the pituitary gland, which sends a message to the adrenal cortex, it's like telephone, and tells it to release cortisol into the body. And what we see through that process is an increase in how we're using fuel so that we can really focus on being productive and what we need to do to get to deal with the threat, right? To either freeze or to run away, depending on the type of bear, as I learned. We're also going to suppress our non-essential processes through this system. So things like digestion, reproduction, we don't need that in that moment. We need to be able to fight, flight, or freeze. So that's what we're focused on. It also tells the body to release these things called endogenous opioids, which are substances that we have. They're kind of like our body's medicine that are available to repair tissue and to handle pain, just in case you're actually attacked by this bear. The problem is sometimes the human stress response system, which is supposed to down-regulate itself once cortisol is released into the body, if your brain, after receiving that message, doesn't correctly evaluate the threat, or you are exposed to a really extreme threat, which may then result in a series of false alarm bells down the road, this can go awry, and we start to see symptoms of traumatic stress. Typical symptoms of traumatic stress are currently grouped into 4 different categories that line up eventually with the PTSD diagnosis. So intrusion symptoms include things like really persistent and intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, very classic PTSD symptoms. Avoidance symptoms could involve avoiding memories or locations, places that are related to the trauma, but it could involve just avoiding people and feelings in general so that you don't have to deal with the really strong negative emotions that come up. We also see alterations in arousal and reactivity, which used to be conceptualized just as hyperarousal. But we now know that some people will experience hyperarousal and hypervigilance, that feeling of being keyed up, that feeling of maybe being alone in the house at night and, having your sort of your guard up, feeling your heart race if you think you see a shadow go by the window, something like that. Other folks will experience hypoarousal and may actually be less vigilant, less activated in response to potential threats, which also can be problematic because they may not, essentially their alarm bell is not working correctly, right? And may not notice threats in the same way as somebody who has not experienced the traumatic exposure. We also see the alterations in cognition and mood in a negative way. So negative outlook on the world, irritability, negative views of relationships, self and others. When we think about acute versus chronic post-traumatic stress, most people will experience something like this after a traumatic event. And most of the time it will resolve within 1 month. And most of the time it will not severely impact your functioning or cause a lot of distress. So to be diagnosed with PTSD, this persists for more than 1 month and also involves that significant impairment in maybe your work life, your relationships, school. We need to see that impairment and distress for it to be actually considered a disorder. We also see things looking a little different if it's what we call a single incident trauma. So a trauma, basically traumatic event that basically has a beginning and an end, like a car accident or a hurricane, okay? They may be quite traumatic, but there's a beginning and an end to them. A complex trauma, on the other hand, is an event that lasts over a long period of time or a series of events. And usually these are interpersonal traumas like child abuse, like torture in prisoner of war populations, things like that. And what we see is that the effects, the long-term consequences of a traumatic event looks a little different based from a single incident trauma to a complex trauma. And one way to conceptualize this is to think about intent, control, and consequences. So what we see is the long-term effects of a traumatic event, the psychological trauma that the person experiences, is related to the intent of the source or the perpetrator and how much control the individual felt during that experience. So if you think about a quote unquote act of God, okay, like a natural disaster, a hurricane, depending on your spiritual or religious persuasion, this is not deliberate. This is not something that was deliberately done, and we have no control over this event. We can't control the weather, okay? An accident, on the other hand, by definition, not deliberate, right? And involves a loss of control, either by you or by someone else that caused harm to you. When someone experiences harm from someone else, though, this is deliberate. And there is a sense of negative control. There is a sense that they actually have not only lost control, but it was taken from them. The control is taken by somebody else, and there's a power dynamic there. So we tend to see the most severe consequences resulting from those intentional acts of an interpersonal nature. We see higher rates of diagnosis of a multitude of psychological disorders, including PTSD and other trauma and stressor-related disorders. So we're talking about things here like sexual trauma, particularly child sexual trauma, combat, torture survivors, etc. The effects of complex post-traumatic stress can also look a little bit different. This came originally, the original concept from Judith Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery in 1992, and was pointing out that the symptoms that we see in survivors of these complex traumas are different from the symptoms that we were seeing in the veterans who were returning from Vietnam, which is the population that our PTSD diagnosis was essentially normed on. It looks a bit different. So, in addition to some of those classic PTSD symptoms, we also see very commonly alterations in how we're able to regulate our emotions. We see difficulty paying attention. We see lots of issues with self-esteem, self-concept, how we relate to others, how our trust in others, our trust in authority figures, and also how we make meaning out of our experiences in life. We also see a lot more somatization and medical issues. I mentioned autoimmune disorders before. We also see commonly digestive issues, IBS. We see migraines. We see polycystic ovarian syndrome. So a lot of medical issues going along with this as well, which is consistent with what we know about ACEs and the effects of trauma on the body and brain, especially the developing body and brain. So, what happens when somebody is chronically exposed to stress instead of in a single incident trauma is that there is this constant sort of state of elevation or sort of misfiring of that human stress response. It's not able to regulate itself. We see the immune response being suppressed, right? We talked about those autoimmune disorders. We see brain structures actually atrophying, getting smaller in volume, for example, the hippocampus, so that our long-term memories are not consolidated properly, specifically that we have trouble integrating sensory memories with biographical or episodic memories. There is a very well-known book called The Body Keeps the Score. Many of you may have read it. And the argument that the author, Dr. Vanderkolk, makes is that we store trauma in our bodies. We store trauma in our sensory system. So many survivors of trauma will have really clear sensory memories of a traumatic event, but might have a lot of difficulty telling you exactly when, where, how it happened. Those episodic memories are disconnected from those sensory memories. We also see numbing of both physical and emotional pain, thanks to the chronic release of those substances in the body that are designed to repair tissue, right? And we see a lot of disruption to the frontal and prefrontal cortex, which of course is like your brain's CEO. So lots of issues there in terms of organization, attention, ability to produce language, emotion regulation, you name it. It's all located in this very important part of our brain. So I want to zoom out because in addition to recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in individuals, what we want to do tonight is think about how this affects whole groups, populations, communities, cultures. So let's look at this at a broader level. When we think about collective trauma, this is an event or maybe several events that is going to impact a whole group of people. And typically, we're talking about an event like when we talked about historical and cultural trauma that involves that oppression, subjugation, marginalization of one group by another group that is dominant over that group in some way, holds some type of privilege. It can also refer to large-scale natural disasters, mass violence, war, and pandemics. Okay. So think about these events really as complex traumatic events, even if it's a natural disaster. If it's a large-scale natural disaster, it's hard to consider that a single incident trauma because often there are ripple effects afterwards. So think about this as complex trauma writ large, and think about this in terms of intent, control, and consequences. If we're talking about an event in which one group is attempting to harm another, the intent, the control, and consequences can be really severe. I also want to introduce a philosophical concept called the social scapegoat. And when we think about a scapegoat, right, this is basically someone or something that we blame something on. It's somebody who gets thrown under the bus, right, that takes the heat for something in particular. And when we think about this at a broader societal level, we see this showing up again and again across history, examples of where a broader or dominant group have used other people or another group as kind of like the poison vessels or the containers for the ills of society. At least that's how it's conceptualized. And what happens there is there's a projection of maybe some feelings of something you don't like about yourself or you don't like about the community or society, something that you are mad about, uncomfortable with, that gets projected outwards towards someone else. And often this involves displacing that group of people somehow, whether it's physically or just othering them and making life really difficult, for example, by taking away some of their civil rights. And the result is persecution. Okay, so we can think about many examples of this across history. We can think of the persecution of witches in the 17th century and in the Americas and in Europe. We can think of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, right? We can think of mass incarceration of Black and brown people in this country following the war on drugs and other movements. And I would argue that this is showing up in several ways today. And think about that for a moment. I would argue that this is happening to our trans and gender nonconforming communities right now. The social scapegoat. Okay. So social scapegoats, the folks who experience this often experience collective trauma, along with these other examples that we've discussed. So how does this show up in society? There is a psychological impact to individuals and societies, which looks pretty similar to the psychological impact that we see when we talked about PTSD. We see a lot of the same symptoms. We see a lot of those complex trauma symptoms as well. There's effects on the very identity, social fabric of a culture. We see economic, social, political consequences, which we'll talk about in a moment. The good news is we also see change, moving towards change. We see the development of stronger coping mechanisms, and it is possible to see some resilience develop through this experience of collective trauma. So let's think about the lasting effects of a collective traumatic experience. And I want to use the example of one that I think, well, I know that we all experienced, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And 5 years on now, which is hard to believe, we have still seen significant increases in anxiety, depression, and PTSD, some studies showing at the height as much as a 25% increase in those presentations. We saw this interacting with that intergenerational trauma in various ways. Difficulty accessing care for people of color, right? Higher rates in certain communities that have been traditionally marginalized, higher rates of death, right, as a result of COVID-19 infection. We have seen ongoing economic roller coaster. We have seen healthcare costs increase. It seems like every week I'm reading stories about the loneliness epidemic and how the social isolation that was really at its peak during our physical isolation times persists today, and we're still seeing a lot of loneliness and isolation in the community. And I think what we're seeing show up, quite recently, in the wake of the acute phase of COVID-19 is a lot of political instability, a lot of erosion of trust in institutions, in government, in vaccines, right, in our medical institutions, and fragmentation, divisiveness into groups. And we have seen that very clearly over the past 5 years. Some of it was already in progress when COVID-19 happened, of course, but the pandemic certainly furthered that. And it's very consistent with other collective traumas that we've seen across history. So how do we respond? It's a big question, isn't it? And I certainly do not have all the answers. But I do think that we can take this framework forward and think about maybe just a few ways that we can begin to respond and at least try to resist re-traumatizing both as individuals and then working together as a community. So I want to share a quote that I love from Judith Herman, who I mentioned before. And she said, without the context of a political movement, it has never been possible to advance the study of psychological trauma. And this is really interesting to think about. Often, sea changes in our understanding of traumatic events and how they affect people occur during and after, as we're kind of analyzing what happened, major sociopolitical shifts or large movements, cultural movements. So we talked about the Vietnam War, right, and the impact that had on how we understand trauma. Um, so many resources and so much attention finally was paid to this issue because it could not be ignored. The demand amongst the veterans returning was so high. And we have seen this show up across the decades following in the equal rights movement, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and which overlapped with the collective trauma of the pandemic, of course. And I want us to think about what's going on now, and what kind of change that may not only drive but force, because I believe we are at one of those moments where a sea change is coming. Since we are at this critical moment, we have an opportunity to respond as individuals, as communities, organizations, whatever your context may be, and more broadly as in society, in a trauma-informed way. And some of you are already trauma-informed professionals, and some of you are not. And that's okay. You can do this, and you can certainly follow up and read about this, the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care, which gives us a little bit of a framework. And they're listed here: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and then that awareness of cultural, historical, and gender issues and context, which is something that I hope may have increased a little bit for some folks tonight. So as we think about all of this, how are we doing as a collective in responding in a trauma-informed way? I think maybe not so great right now. And I would invite us to think a bit about what this could look like, how we might be able to increase our efforts within these categories in more specific ways. And I want to focus on 3 this evening because I think they're a little bit more accessible in this moment. I think a lot of folks are not feeling safe right now, and we can do our best, as a society to try to bolster that, and I hope we do. But I think that is a reality of the moment that we are in. Same thing with trustworthiness and transparency and how we're feeling about our governmental institutions as a collective. But I've been having a lot of conversations lately with students, clients, about how we cope in this moment and what can we do. I think a lot of folks are feeling powerless and helpless, which is making that empowerment piece very difficult as well. And what seems to be helping is to try to come together, to come into groups that do feel uh, safe as possible, that do feel like they're holding to you, reaching out to your networks so that you can support each other, but also so that you can collaborate and come together to perhaps work on certain issues that are key or really important to you. So I'm having conversations with lots of folks about, look, none of us are experts on everything. So let's come together into groups and decide what are the issues that we are really going to focus on, what is really important to us. And perhaps divide up the work, right? How are we going to tackle this? Because we have a big task in front of us right now. So what are those few projects that you can work on and how can you collaborate? The other piece that I would really recommend and urge is in every way possible. And again, thank you for coming tonight. And I hope that this helps in our awareness of context. Please try to educate yourself as much as possible on things like historical, cultural, intergenerational trauma, how current events are not happening in a vacuum, and they're happening in the context of hundreds, thousands of years of traumatic history for many groups. And that really makes it different for some folks than it does for others. And I think that can really go a long way to increase empathy and understanding of how folks are feeling right now, and really at any point when something difficult and really life altering is happening in our communities. So, what does a resilient response to collective trauma or an individual trauma look like? And it's nice to end or move towards, ending on a note about resilience, because we do know that actually resilience is the modal outcome, meaning that most people are able to be resilient following a traumatic event. And in fact, most communities and societies are able to be resilient following a traumatic event. And what we see, though we certainly aren't at an endpoint yet, is that we see an increase in how people come together. We see an increase in a sense of purpose and focus. What do I want to really do? What do I want to prioritize in my life? What's important to me in as I try to make my community better? We see folks giving more, donating more, getting more involved in organizations, which I hope is beginning to happen. Um, we see a sense sometimes of collective healing, and that is, I think, going to take time, but that is something that we see across history as an outcome, a modal outcome, following something that's an important practice to come together following a collective traumatic event. So thank you so much. That is all I have in terms of content this evening, and I think we did okay on time. I am always